What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the macro developments coming out of the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, if that is something that you're interested in, maybe consider subscribing. For everyone else, it's good to see you. I'm sorry there was not an episode over the weekend. It's been crazy busy. It's the end of the year for me. Like I said, this is a midweek episode. We're just going to jump in. There's a few major stories. There's mess with Australia and China, which we're going to deal with first, because I think that's what a lot of people are looking at around the world at the moment. But then there are also some very important economic stories that we need to touch on, and of course China-US is always relevant, so we'll be touching on that as well. If you enjoy the episode, as always guys, it really does help if you smash the like button. It's a huge help. It's just down there in the corner, and it really does help with the algorithm. And my Patreon details are in the description below for anyone who wants to go the extra mile. That said though, let's just jump into this week's midweek episode of China Update. Okay, like I said, let's start with the land down under. The Australia-China relationship is in free fall, with relations at their worst point since normalization began decades ago. Just a few years ago, Pew polling indicated that Australian public opinion towards China was some of the most favorable in the developed world and in Asia, and had been so for almost 2 decades. However, in the last 18 months, public opinion of China in Australia has collapsed, with unfavorability rates now some of the highest in the world. Now, before we look at the latest development, if you want some more context on why the China-Australia relationship is so bad currently, and what Beijing's thinking is vis-a-vis this relationship and what its actions have been over the last couple of months, check out this video here from about a week and a half ago. We talk about some of Beijing's demands and do a little bit of analysis on just what went wrong in the relationship. Okay, so what has happened over the last few days within the relationship? On Saturday, China's Commerce Ministry imposed temporary anti-dumping measures, which range from 107.1% to 212.1% on Australian wine imports. China is the biggest destination for Australia's wine exports, accounting for 39% of total shipments. Since the start of November, China has unofficially banned Australian imports of coal, sugar, barley, lobsters, wine, copper, and log timber. As I'm sure a lot of you guys have already seen, on Monday, in a very provocative move, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian posted an image created by a local nationalistic artist on Twitter, depicting an Australian soldier holding a knife to the throat of a young Afghan child. With the image, Zhao Lijian wrote that he was, quote, shocked by the murder of Afghan citizens and prisoners by Australian soldiers, end quote, and he called for accountability. I'm sure you guys have seen this in the news. Most of you probably have seen the image as well. Now, as we look at this specific episode, we need to take a step back and remember that what we are seeing is a rhetorical escalation in a months-long deterioration in the China-Australia relationship. For our purposes here, as well as actually looking at what exactly happened and what the reactions of both sides were, we also need to think about, one, what this means for other middle powers around the world watching, who have high degrees of trade exposure to the PRC market, and two, how this appears to be a new normal in PRC global PR efforts and its diplomatic stance and its diplomatic language, and what are the risks for China in taking this more adversarial approach. Okay, back to the tweet. Zhao Lijian is referring in his tweet to findings in a report published by an independent commission set up by the Australian government. The report found evidence of 39 murders of civilians and prisoners in Afghanistan by members of the Australian Special Forces over an 11-year period. The Australian government established a new office of the Special Investigator to investigate further criminal conduct and recommended prosecution of individuals involved. Australia's Prime Minister and top military commander apologised after the publication of the report. The Afghanistan government condemned the murders but welcomed the Australian government report as a, quote, step towards justice, end quote. A few days before posting the tweet, Zhao Lijian told reporters at a press conference in Beijing that the Australian report, quote, fully exposed the hypocrisy of the human rights and freedom these Western countries are always chanting, end quote. Now, Zhao Lijian's tweet sparked outrage in Australia. Its optics globally are also quite poor, at a time when many nations around the world are increasingly concerned about Beijing's aggressive diplomacy. A French Foreign Ministry statement best sums up a typical response in some diplomatic circles, saying, quote, "We do not consider the tweet in question to be worthy of the methods one would expect from the diplomacy of a country like China," end quote. It's difficult to say what Zhao's motivations were angering a US ally like this just weeks before Biden, who has called for a united front with allies to counter China, is likely to enter the White House. It could be that Beijing is making an example out of Australia as a warning to others, as it has been doing for the last few months, it seems. It could be stepping up its whataboutism narratives to insulate China against human rights criticisms from other countries, particularly in the West or in the developed world. It could be for a domestic or an overseas Chinese expat audience, or perhaps for some in the developing world. It could be a clumsy way of pushing a China is peaceful and the West are warmongers type narrative. It could be that ultra ethno-nationalism has become a mainstream ideological factor amongst policymakers and elite in Beijing, or at least within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Or it could just simply be that this sort of action is within the scope of the new aggressive or assertive style of diplomacy that the PRC has adopted over the last 12 months. Prime Minister Scott Morrison of Australia on Monday denounced a tweet from the Foreign Ministry and demanded an apology. That day, the Chinese government supported officially the comment that was made on Twitter by Zhao Lijian, with his boss, Senior Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying, defending the statement and the image at an official press conference, saying, quote, "The Australian side has reacted so strongly to my colleague's Twitter. Does that mean that they think the cold-blood murder of Afghan innocent civilians is justified, while other people's condemnation of such crimes is not justified?" End quote. The ultra-nationalistic parts of the state media smelled blood in the water immediately and jumped into overdrive. And boy, have I had to read a lot of toxic stuff over the last few days. Quote, "Australia is urban, rural fringe of Western civilization where gangsters roamed. If the US wants to do something bad, it seeks thugs in such places. Australian Army's killing of Afghan civilians and at Scott Morrison MP's attitude prove Canberra's barbarism." End quote. The Global Times also published an editorial entitled, quote, "China's goodwill fertile with evil Australia," end quote, saying, quote, "China has never taken the initiative to provoke Australia. The two countries have no historical disputes. Australia's evil acts towards China have made Chinese society not only surprised, but also disgusted. Many Chinese people feel as though they have swallowed a fly when hearing about Australia." End quote. Most troubling, in my view at least, on Tuesday, Senior Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying endorsed framing increasing global concern towards China generally and reactions to this episode with this tweet in particular as a racial conflict. Quote, "I've also read an article on WeChat that I want to share with you. It's titled, 'I Can, You Cannot: Seeing the Psychology of Westerners from the Australian Incident.' I believe this article speaks for a lot of Chinese people," and goes on in the quote to say, "This 'I can, you cannot' approach reflects the attitude of those unbelievably arrogant hypocrites. Their real motive is to deprive China of the right to tell facts and truth. They are afraid to hear that loud and clear voice, 'Look, the emperor has no clothes on.'" Now, she was referring to a very popular article that was on WeChat. This is a quote from the original article. Quote, "The general principle behind their consistent behavior characteristics is simply, 'I can, you can't.' This is the consistent style of doing things by white people in Europe and America. In any behavior, white people in Europe and America, must be in an advantageous and strong position while you are in a weak position." End quote. Now, with that heavy story out of the way, let's look at something a bit lighter. Bonds, the bond market. We have been discussing over the last few weeks that there has been a bit of a shock to investor confidence for large state-owned enterprises that have rattled China's nearly $4 trillion US dollar corporate debt market. Several recent high-profile defaults have undermined the previous assumption that large state-owned enterprises would be bailed out by local governments. These include Yongcheng, a group of Henan province, which failed to pay what would be worth US dollars 152 million US dollars to bondholders in November 10th to be specific. Tsinghua's Uni Group, a chip maker which defaulted on approximately 198 million US dollars 6 days after that default. And BMW's main Chinese joint venture partner, Brilliance, failed to pay what would be worth 149 million US dollar bond. Its parent company, Huachen, which is the biggest SOE in 45 million people strong Liaoning province, is also in a bit of trouble. Many in English and Chinese media have observed that the lack of state support for SOEs suggests China has confidence in the economy's ability to absorb state-owned enterprise failures, particularly big ones that have not been doing well over the last few years, and that regulators wish to promote more lending discipline to improve capital allocation in the economy. However, there are 2 points that we need to keep in mind when we think about this. The first is that most state-owned enterprise funding within the mainland of China comes from state-run banks, not selling bonds. Bank loans represent about 4 to 5 times the financing of bond sales on average. And 2, as Peking University finance professor Michael Pettis has pointed out many times, quote, "As long as local governments pressured by Beijing try to generate levels of economic activity that exceed growth in the underlying economy, there simply is no way to prevent businesses from making bad investment decisions and lenders from making bad lending decisions. That is the only way to bridge the gap between what the economy can productively deliver and the GDP growth target. This isn't just about doing what it takes finally to impose lending discipline. China's financial system is structurally locked into indisciplined lending." He goes on to say, quote, "They can overhaul the Chinese financial system all they like, but as long as SOEs and the local governments are required to generate more GDP growth than the economy can productively manage, there is simply no way to do this without encouraging bad lending. And if it isn't SOEs, then it must be something else." End quote. Okay, capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Recent reports by Forbes and Hurun indicate that China's wealthiest people have seen a massive increase in their total wealth in the year 2020, in this year, much more as a percentage than their US counterparts. China's 400 richest people now have a total wealth of, in US dollars, 2.11 trillion US dollars, a 64% surge from last year's 1.29 trillion US dollars. By comparison, America's 400 richest are now worth 3.2 trillion US dollars, an increase of 8.2% in wealth compared to 2019. On Monday, Chinese media reports the Chinese Foreign Ministry sanctioned 4 American nationals for, quote, "countermeasures against previous US sanctions on Chinese officials over Hong Kong affairs, stressing that these people are not welcome in China and will be banned from entering the country, including the Hong Kong and Macau special administrative regions." End quote. On Tuesday, a congressional advisory panel in the United States recommended that the director of the de facto US Embassy in Taiwan, the American Institute in Taiwan, should be confirmed by the Senate, which would place him or her on a similar level as a US ambassador. The panel also warned that China could, quote, "potentially employ military means to pursue unification," end quote. The Financial Times reported on a draft EU plan for revitalizing the transatlantic, that is between Europe and North America, partnership. The paper says the EU-US partnership needs, quote, "maintenance and renewal if the democratic world is to assert its interests against authoritarian powers and closed economies that exploit our openness," end quote. On Wednesday, in an interview with the New York Times, Joe Biden said the US President Trump's 25% tariffs imposed on China under the Phase 1 trade agreement will remain in place at the start of his new administration. Quote, "I'm not going to make any immediate moves. and the same applies to the tariffs, end quote. And last up, state media on Sunday wrote about a conference last Thursday where the chairman of the Power Construction Corp of China, Yan Zhiyong, announced China will, quote, implement hydropower exploration in the downstream of the Yalong-Zangbo River, end quote, going on to say, quote, there is no parallel in history. It will be a historic opportunity for the Chinese hydropower industry, end quote. And that 150-kilometer section alone offered the potential of developing 70 million kilowatts, which, quote, equals more than the 3 Gorges power stations, end quote. The report indicates that the hydropower project could be built on the so-called Great Bend of the Brahmaputra and at the Yalong-Zangbo Grand Canyon in Medong County, where the river falls over 2,000 meters and turns to flow across the border into northeast India. The report has raised eyebrows in India and is likely going to aggravate the already tense relationship between the two Asian giants. The Brahmaputra flows through Tibet, India, and Bangladesh, and is seen by India as a critical water source for its northeast provinces. Any attempt of China to stem the flow of the river may be seen as a national security threat by New Delhi. Okay guys, that is China Update for this week. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Leave your comments below. I always love hearing from you guys, and I will see you next time. Wherever you are, stay safe, stay sane. I will see you next time on China Update.